Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're exploring something really fascinating. It sits right at the intersection of, personal ambition, business strategy, and maybe legacy too.
Exactly. We're digging into some specific research here, a doctoral thesis actually, that asks this really crucial question for, well, anyone who's ever built a business from the ground up.
Right, which is when it's finally time to step away, why do some founders look past, say, family or an outside buyer and choose to hand ownership over to their employees?
Yeah, and this thesis looks specifically at founders in the UK who did just that, often using this structure called an employee ownership trust or an EOT.
Okay.
So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to unpack the motivations, the experiences behind choosing this particular exit route, drawing, straight from what the research found.
Great. So let's dive in. I mean, every single business founder, eventually they face this, don't they? This inevitable question of how to exit the firm. It's not really if, it's just when.
And look, this isn't just a theoretical point anymore. It's becoming much more significant, especially in places like the UK and other developed economies. We're seeing this huge demographic wave.
The aging population of owners.
Exactly. A rapidly growing number of business owners are hitting retirement age or thinking about it.
And the sort of classic picture, the default almost, has always been passing the business down, right? The family transfer.
That's definitely the historical image, yes. But what this research really shines a light on is that, well, family succession is actually declining.
Oh, really? Why is that?
It's a mix of things. Some are very practical, some more personal.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. Is it just, the kids aren't interested these days?
That's definitely a major factor. A lot of the founders in this study, they found themselves in situations where, well, maybe they didn't have children or the kids were just too young.
Or maybe not the right fit for the job.
Or, frankly, yeah, they didn't feel their children were suitable for running that specific business. It takes a certain toke, doesn't it?
If I remember reading about Julian Richer from Richer Sounds, who chose this EOT path, he said something quite blunt, didn't he? About not having a spoilt child to leave his life's work to.
He did, and it's blunt, but it really gets at that core issue, finding the right person, the right steward for what you've built.
Yeah.
And the study mentioned another founder whose son had gone off to work for a Skype founder. I mean, that sends a pretty clear signal, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Different aspiration.
Completely different career paths, yeah.
Yeah.
A world away from the family firm, perhaps.
And it's not just about the kids' choices, is it? Maybe the founders themselves are hesitant, like not wanting to pressure them.
That came through loud and clear in the research, too. Reluctance to push children into a role they might not want or thrive in. Plus, sometimes the age gaps are bigger now, people starting families later.
Right.
It all adds up. And then you have some founders who just, on principle, based on their own values, rejected the whole idea of hereditary business transfer.
Okay, so if that traditional family route is becoming less common, and you mentioned that past research often looked at, say, business failures or maybe big external buyouts.
Often overlooking these cases where successful firms were deliberately transferred, but not within the family.
Right, so this is where employee ownership and specifically these EOTs in the UK, they come into the frame.
Exactly. This research positions it as this rapidly growing, actually, but still kind of understudied alternative way out for founders.
So just to be clear, when this study talks about employee ownership, what exactly does that mean? What's the definition they're using?
Yeah, good question. The focus here is specifically on companies where the majority of the shares, so over 50%, end up being owned by the employees.
Okay. And is that like every employee gets a little packet of shares in their name?
Well, it can be. You can have that direct ownership model, maybe through things like share incentive plans, SIPs, or save as you earn schemes.
Right.
But this research, it really zooms in on the indirect model. That's where the shares aren't held by individuals directly, but they're held in a trust.
A trust.
Yeah, a trust that exists purely for the collective benefit of all the employees.
And the EOT, the Employee Ownership Trust, that's the specific legal vehicle for doing that in the UK.
That's the one. It was brought in by legislation back in 2014. It essentially created this purpose-built trust structure and, importantly, bundled it with some tax incentives to, well, encourage founders to consider it.
Interesting. And presumably there are theories about why this might be good for the business itself, not just the exiting founder.
Oh, definitely. The research touches on a couple of theoretical angles. There's the resource-based view, which basically suggests that employee ownership can boost human capital. Meaning employees might feel more invested, more engaged, maybe more productive when they have a real stake in the company's success. They feel like owners.
Makes.
And then there's agency theory. That perspective suggests that by aligning the interests of the owners who are now the employees with the interests of the business itself, you reduce potential conflicts. Everyone's pulling in the same direction, theoretically.
Yeah, I can see that. If the employees know they'll benefit directly when the company performs well, their goals are naturally going to be much more aligned with, the company's overall health and success.
Precisely. That's the core idea.
So we've established these background pressures, the aging founders, the decline of family succession. What are the specific things really pushing founders towards making that exit decision? What makes them finally say, okay, it's time?
Well, beyond that general demographic trend we talked about, the lack of a clear family successor is a huge immediate pressure point for many.
Right, those reasons we covered: no kids, kids too young, unsuitable, or just.
Or just, having totally different dreams and ambitions, like that founder's son working for the tech billionaire. It's a clear signal.
And the founders respecting that, not wanting to force the issue.
Absolutely. A real reluctance to pressure their children came through. Add in those potentially wider age gaps. And for many founders in this study, family succession just wasn't really a runner. It wasn't viable or maybe even desirable for them.
That also makes you think about retirement itself. It must be so different for an entrepreneur compared to someone who's just, an employee clocking out for the last time.
Oh, completely different. It's not just stopping work. It's stepping away from something you poured your life into, something you built from nothing.
Your identity is tied up in it.
Massively. The research highlights this retirement is a key reason for exiting entrepreneurship, sure, but it's actually less studied for founders than for regular employees.
Yeah.
That deep psychological attachment, that interdependency between the founder and their venture, it heavily shapes how and when they decide to let go.
Okay, this is where, for me, the research gets really interesting, because it wasn't just that these founders happened to land on employee ownership. The study suggests they were actively, deliberately rejecting the other options.
That's such a crucial point. They considered the common alternatives and consciously turned away from them. Selling the business to a competitor or another company, a trade sale that was widely rejected.
Really? But isn't that often seen as the way to get the maximum financial return? Cash out big?
You'd think so,
Mm-hmm.
but for many of these founders, the potential financial gain just wasn't the top priority.
Yeah.
They had deep-seated fears and sometimes actual past negative experiences with acquisitions.
What kind of fears?
The whole process was seen as invasive, for one. And there was this huge fear of what they called seller's remorse.
Regretting selling their baby, as they say.
Exactly that. There's this powerful quote in the research about seeing their business potentially trashed by third parties and not wanting that fate for their baby. It really shows the emotional weight.
Yeah.
They worried about their loyal employees losing jobs. They worried about buyers just stripping assets or fundamentally changing the company's culture and values after the deal was done.
And what about those deals where the founder has to stick around for a bit, the earnouts?
Oh, universally disliked, it seems. Widely rejected. Founders described it as being stuck with, and I think this quote captures it perfectly, a lot of pressure with a lot of responsibility, but no authority.
Oof, that sounds awful.
Doesn't it? They felt they'd be forced bystanders, watching their life's work potentially get damaged and at worst destroyed, while having to answer to new owners, not a position they wanted to be in.
No wonder they ruled out trade sales. So, okay, what about a management buyout, an MBO, where the existing managers take over?
Yeah, that was considered too. But the founders in this study generally rejected that as well.
Why? Isn't that keeping it somewhat in the family, so to speak?
Kind of. But the key objection was that an MBO transfers ownership only to a select few of the management team, not the entire workforce.
Ah, I see.
And critically, they saw the EOT as being much more secure against a future sale down the line. They worried the managers who did an MBO might just turn around and sell the business on again later, defeating the purpose of preserving it.
Okay. What about the ultimate fallback, just closing the doors, winding it down?
Generally, no. That was seen as, well, almost unethical. Like destroying the community they built, abandoning the employees. It just wasn't compatible with their values.
But
interestingly, some founders did say they would rather have closed the whole thing down than sell it to someone unsuitable, someone who wouldn't respect what they'd built.
wow, that's a strong statement.
It is. One founder mentioned the EOT allowed them to have a clear conscience about what you have done, which implies the other options wouldn't have offered that peace of mind.
So if they're actively pushing away these traditional, maybe even more financially rewarding options, What was the positive pull towards employee ownership? What made them say, yes, this is the way?
This is the absolute core of it. The research shows it boils down to these powerful, non-economic identity-based reasons. The study actually used a framework looking at social identity to understand this.
Social identity. What does that mean in this context?
They found two really prominent types of drivers shaping the decision. First, what they call communitarian drivers.
Yeah.
Yeah, these founders felt a really strong connection to the social community within their company. They deeply believed their employees had been vital to the firm's success, and therefore deserved to genuinely share in the value they had helped create.
So seeing the business almost like a shared endeavor.
Exactly. And they saw the EOT as a way to kind of endow that community, to secure its future. There's a great quote capturing this. It fitted with my values. The people who have worked here, they've put a lot in. That really sums up that communitarian feeling.
That makes a lot of sense. Giving back to the team, what was the second driver?
The second type was missionary drivers. Here, the motivation was more about protecting the firm's unique purpose, its specific values, or maybe even contributing to some broader social mission.
So less about the internal community, more about the external impact or the company's soul.
Precisely. You see this in quotes about wanting to change the world, or thinking about work in terms of financial well-being. It's about happiness, not money. Wanting to make a world a better place, maybe counteracting inequality in some small way.
So these founders saw their business as more than just a profit machine.
Absolutely. It represented something more, a set of values, a way of operating, a contribution they wanted to see continue. Even firms without an obvious social mission had strong, distinct cultures the founders fiercely wanted to protect.
Right. So were founders usually one or the other, communitarian or missionary?
The research suggests there could be hybrid identities, a mix of both. But these two drivers, the communitarian and the missionary, were really the dominant forces pushing them specifically towards the EOT, especially after they'd already ruled out those other alternatives like trade sales or MBOs.
Okay, so they've decided employee ownership, likely via an EOT, is the right path for them, driven by these deep values. What was the actual process like? Did they just call their lawyer and accountant and get it done?
Not quite. Often far from it, actually. One of the really striking findings was how many founders sort of stumbled upon the EOT option, almost by chance.
Really? Not through their usual advisors?
Apparently not. Their regular accountants, lawyers, even bankers, the people you'd think would know often weren't suggesting it.
That seems odd. Why wouldn't they?
Well, the research suggests a couple things. Sometimes, these traditional advisors just lacked knowledge about EOTs. They weren't common knowledge, perhaps. Other times, they were actively skeptical, even hostile towards the idea.
Hostile? Why?
Potentially because their focus, maybe their incentive structure, was geared towards maximizing the founder's immediate financial payout. A trade sale often looks better on that metric.
The agency theory thing again. The advisor's interests potentially clashing with the founder's bigger picture goals.
Exactly. The advisor might see their agency role as simply getting the highest price, whereas the founder has these other non-financial objectives that the EOT serves better.
So founders were kind of left navigating this themselves.
They really had to be quite resilient, quite persistent. They often had to actively go looking for specialist advisors who actually understood employee ownership.
Where did they find them?
Connecting with organizations like the Employee Ownership Association, the EOA, was crucial, and talking to other founders who'd already gone through the EOT process. That peer network was really important. One founder specifically said the EOA pointed them to the right people.
Okay, so they find the right advice eventually. What about the money side? How does the actual transfer get funded if the employees aren't buying it directly?
Right. This often involves something called deferred consideration.
Meaning
Meaning the founder doesn't get all the money up front. They agree to receive some, or maybe even all, of the purchase price over a period of time, paid out from the company's future profits.
so the company essentially buys itself back over time.
In effect, yes, using its own future earnings. Sometimes founders also personally lent money to the trust to help kickstart the transaction.
Wow. So they might actually accept less money overall, or at least wait longer for it, compared to a quick cash sale to an outsider.
Very possibly, yes. The research talks about emotional pricing here. Founders were often willing to make financial concessions, structure the deal differently.
Because the non-financial outcome was more important.
Exactly. Securing the right home for the business, one that aligned with their values, was worth more to them than just squeezing the last penny out of a deal.
Were there any sort of commercial upsides for the founder in doing it this way, despite maybe getting less upfront?
Yes, there were some practical advantages. Tying payments to future profits actually reduced some risk for the founder. They were getting paid out of the ongoing success they helped build and continue to influence, perhaps.
Okay.
And the transaction costs, the fees, and so on were generally lower than orchestrating a big external sale.
And those tax benefits we touched on earlier, were they a big part of the calculation?
Oh, hugely significant. Described by some founders as the real clincher.
Remind us what they were.
Two main things in the UK legislation. First, the company can pay annual bonuses to employees, tax-free, up to £3,600 per person per year.
That's a nice perk for the staff.
Definitely. And second, for the founder, if they sell a controlling stake that's 51% or more to an EOT, the proceeds from that sale can be completely exempt from capital gains tax.
Wow, okay. That's potentially a massive saving for the founder.
It really is. And founders saw this whole package as fair. The employee bonus, in particular, was seen as a very tangible, direct way for the staff to benefit from the new ownership structure. One founder talked about it giving that payback back to the employees.
Now, the research also makes this distinction between exiting ownership and exiting management. Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, it's a really important nuance. Selling your shares to the EOT means you've exited ownership. You no longer control the company in that ultimate sense.
Right.
But exiting management, stepping back from the day-to-day running, the CEO role or whatever, that's a separate decision.
And many founders didn't do both at once.
Exactly. The study found many founders transferred ownership to the EOT, but stayed involved in some capacity. Maybe still in a management role, maybe leading a specific function, maybe sitting on the main company board.
Or on the EOT's board.
Or becoming a trustee of the EOT itself, yes.
What? Hang on. If the goal was to exit.
Well, a couple of key reasons emerged. Firstly, safeguarding their financial interests.
Yeah.
If they were still owed money through deferred consideration or had loans outstanding.
They wanted to keep an eye on things.
Pretty much. One founder was very upfront, saying they stayed on partly to safeguard the family's interest in those loan notes. Makes sense.
Sure.
Secondly, it allowed them to continue influencing the business, to act as a sort of steward, ensuring the values, the culture, the legacy they cared about was actually maintained post-transfer. Another founder described being chair of the trust as their lever on it if things started to drift.
It sounds like finding this EOT option wasn't just a practical solution. It had a pretty profound psychological effect on the founders, too.
Oh, absolutely. Some describe feeling trapped before finding the EOT route, like they were stuck in a prison, unable to see a way out that felt right, given how tied up their identity was with the business.
And the EOT provided that release.
It seemed to. The process involved this psychological stepping back from being the founder, but being able to stay involved in roles they perhaps preferred or that played to their strengths really eased that transition. For many, it wasn't just an ending. It gave them a new impetus, a renewed sense of purpose in this new stewardship role.
So let's try and pull this all together. How did choosing the EOT route ultimately help these founders protect that legacy they cared so much about?
Fundamentally, it let them say no. No to the alternatives, the trade sales, the MBOs that they genuinely felt would damage or destroy their creation and the values it stood for.
So avoiding the negative was key.
Avoiding the negative and choosing a positive path that felt deeply consistent with who they were, their self-identity, their entrepreneurial spirit. Employee ownership allowed their legacy to continue in a form they could believe in, that they felt good about.
And in maintaining those connections, the board roles, the loans that was part of actively shaping that legacy post-exit.
Absolutely. It wasn't just hoping for the best. By retaining some financial leverage and some formal influence through those board or trustee positions, they could actively offset the loss of ultimate shareholder control. It gave them tools to help ensure the firm stayed true to their original vision.
Some even kept shares themselves.
Some did, yes. Retained minority shareholdings, maybe partly to mitigate financial risk, maybe also, as one founder put it, feeling it was only fair they got some upside if the trust eventually hit a massive home run financially years later.
It really speaks to a deep trust in the EOT structure itself to preserve what they'd built, doesn't it?
It does. They genuinely seem to believe that putting the business into an EOT made a future sale to an outside third party much, much less likely. It felt like a permanent solution, securing their legacy against being trashed, as that earlier quote put it.
One even joked about it being harder to sell now.
Yeah, joking about it now, having 20 bosses, the employees, and maybe a sense of entitlement, making it less attractive to an external buyer. A humorous way of saying the structure itself provided protection.
So, listening to all this, our deep dive into this research, it becomes really clear, doesn't it? Founders choosing EOTs. It's often about so much more than just the money. Yes, the tax benefits are there, they're important.
They're often the clincher, as we said.
Yeah.
But they're not usually the primary driver. It's fundamentally a decision driven by values,
Hmm.
stemming from that deep desire to look after the community they built, to keep the mission or the unique character of the business alive, to act as responsible stewards of their legacy, even as they hand over the keys.
And it's a path they often have to fight for a bit, navigating skepticism, finding the right advice, designing those financial structures, all to find an exit that genuinely aligns with who they are and what they built.
Absolutely. It really highlights how important these business transitions are, not just for founders, but for the wider economy.
Hmm.
And it suggests that models like employee ownership offer a really compelling alternative for achieving successful, values-led handovers.
Which leaves us with a really interesting thought for you to chew on. If that legacy, that imprint a founder leaves on a business, is so intensely personal and powerful, how effectively can an employee-owned structure truly ensure that unique imprint lasts long after the founder themselves has finally stepped away?